There was only one catch, and that was Catch-22. This island of Pianosa lies in the Mediterranean Sea, 8 miles south of Elba. It is very small and obviously cannot accommodate all of the actions described. Like the setting of this novel, the characters too are fictitious. Preface to the special edition of Catch-22. Meh. What's the catch? Catch-22. The nation. Catch-22. Candida Donadio Robert Gottlieb. The Times, the Herald Hit Tribune. A wild, moving, shocking, hilarious, raging, exhilarating, giant roller coaster of a book. The reviewer for the Herald Tribune came to read all of this at war by someone who was known entirely the product of coincidence. S.J. Perlman, much better known the subject of an interview by Mr. Dolbear, was publishing his own book just about this time, Catch-22. Times, a dazzling performance that will outrage nearly as many readers as it delights. The New Republic, Catch-22. Essential arguments that much of later criticism has done little to improve on, said Mr. Aldridge, recognizing that in many audiences, Catch-22, the book, just for the reason that caused others to hate it. Sunday Times, a novel that grasps for want of craft and sensibility, is repetitious and monotonous, fails, is an emotional hodgepodge. The New Yorker, Catch-22, doesn't even seem to have been written. Instead, it gives the impression of having been shouted onto the paper. What remains is a debris of sour jokes. And in the end, Heller wallows in his own laughter, finally drowns in it. I am tempted now to drown in laughter as I set this down. Raymond Walters, Catch-22. Christmas Roundup of the Times, 1962, Catch-22. Today's Show, and then a variety show as much as anything else. The interim host was John Chancellor. Mr. Chancellor had recently returned from his newsman's post in the Kremlin and agreed to that position on the condition he interviewed only those people he himself so chose. They read, Yossarian lives. And he confided he'd pasting these stickers secretly on the walls of the corridors and the executive restrooms of the NBC building. 300,000 copies went back to press 5 more times between September and the end of the year, twice each in October and December. And by the end of 1963, there were 11 printings. In England, under the auspices of enterprising young editor Tom Maechler, it was that way from the start, bestseller, there were new rudimentary items, but Catch-22 was quickly at the head of them. For me, the history of Catch-22 begins back in 1953 when I started writing it. In 1953, I was employed as a copywriter at a small advertising agency in New York after 2 years as an instructor in English contemporary composition at Pennsylvania State University, which was then a collegiate. Early on, in anxious need of an approving opinion, I sent the opening chapter off to literary agents I had managed to obtain after publishing a few short stories in magazines like Esquire and The Atlantic. The agents were not impressed, but a young assistant there, Ms. Candida Donadio, was, and she secured permission to submit that chapter to a few publications that regularly published excerpts from novels in progress. In 1955, the chapters appeared in a quarterback called New World Running 7, an anthology that also contained, under a pseudonym, an extract from another novel in progress, Kerouac's On the Road. There came complimentary letters of interest, and a few editors at a few book publishers, and I was encouraged to continue with a work I now saw realistically was going to take me a good many years longer than I first guessed. In 1957, when I had about 270 pages in typescript, I was employed at Time magazine. I wrote advertising sale presentations by day, and when not furtively putting thoughts down on paper for my work on the novel, at home that evening, and Candida Donadio was establishing herself as a preeminent agent in her own right, with a list of American authors as clients as impressive as any. We agreed it made sense to submit the partial manuscript to some publishers, mainly to obtain a practical idea of the potential for publication of this novel we both thought so much of. She was drawn towards a new young editor she knew at Simon & Schuster, one she thought might prove more receptive to innovation than most. His name was Robert Gottlieb. And she was right. When Gottlieb busied himself with these pages, I, with a 4-week summer vacation from bountiful Time magazine, began rewriting them. Gottlieb and I met for lunch, mainly for him to gauge my temperature and how to ascertain how amenable I would be as an author to work with. After I listened to him allude with tact to certain broad suggestions he thought he eventually might be compelled to make, I landed him my new pages with the boastful response that I believe I'd already taken care of nearly all of them. He surprised me with concern that I might take exception to working with someone so young. He was 26. I think I was 34. I must be more greatly surprised to learn from him later that both he and his closest colleagues at Simon & Schuster, Nina Bourne, were intimidated at first by an air of suspicion I projected that I did not even know I possessed. I had not been suspicious of him. I doubt very much that Gottlieb, who went on to become the lead head of Alfred A. Knopf and the editor of the New York Magazine, had ever again been intimidated by anyone. And what I still remember most agreeably about him is that he did not ask for an outline once, a hint of where this 1/3 of a novel he'd seen was going to go. The contract I received called for an advance of $1,500, half on signing, which I did not need, and the remainder on completion and acceptance. Probably I was his first novelist, but that's not his first to be published. Other authors with completed manuscripts came to him in the 3 more years I needed to finish mine. Probably I was Candida's earliest client too. Both were as delighted as I was with the eventual success of Catch-22, and the 3 of us have been reveling in our recollections of the experience ever since. On February 28th, 1962, the journalist Richard Starnes published a column of unrestrained praise in his newspaper, the New York World Telegram, that opened with these years. Yossarian, I think, will live a very long time. His tribute was unexpected, because Mr. Starnes was a newspaperman in hard-boiled mode, whose customer beat was local politics, and the World Telegram was widely regarded as generally conservative. To this day, I am grateful to Mr. Starnes for his unqualified and unsolicited approval, and bless him for the accuracy of his prediction. Yossarian has indeed lived a long time! The World Telegram has passed on. Many of the people mentioned in that first advertisement have died, and most of the rest of us are on our way, but Yossarian is alive. And when the novel ends, because of the motion picture, even close readers of the novel have a final, lasting image of him at sea, paddling toward freedom in a yellow, inflated lifeboat. In the book, he doesn't get that far, but he is not captured, and he isn't dead. And at the end of the successor volume I've just completed, Closing Time, that fleeting cartoon figure is again on the book jacket, but wearing a businessman's chapeau and moving with a cane. And he is already alive, more than 40 years older, but definitely still there. Everyone has got to go. His physician friend in that novel reminds him with emphasis. Everyone. But I ever write another sequel, he would still be around at the end. Sooner or later, I must concede, Yossarian, now 94, will have to pass away too. But it won't be by my hand. Joseph Heller, 1994, East Hampton, New York. Brandon Rennie, 2021, Markham, Ontario. Number 1, The Texan. It was love at first sight. The first time Yossarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him. Yossarian was in the hospital with a pain in his liver. It fell just short of being jaundice. The doctors were puzzled by the fact that it wasn't quite jaundice. They could treat it if it was jaundice, But it didn't become jaundice, and if they went away, he could discharge him. But this being just short of jaundice all the time confused them. Each morning, they came around, 3 brisk and serious men with efficient mouths and inefficient eyes, accompanied by the brisk and serious Nurse Duckett, one of the few ward nurses who didn't like Yossarian. They readied the cart at the foot of the bed and asked impatiently about the pain. They seemed irritated when he told them it was the exact same. Still no movement, the full colonel demanded. The doctors exchanged a look when he stood and shook his head. Give him another pill! Nurse Duckett made a note to give Yossarian another pill, and the 4 of them moved along the bed. None of the nurses liked Yossarian. Actually, the pain in his liver had gone away, but Yossarian didn't say anything, and the doctors never suspected. They just suspected that he had been moving his bowels and not telling anyone. Yossarian had everything he wanted at the hospital. The food wasn't too bad, and his meals were brought to him in bed. There were extra rations of fresh meat, and during the hot part of the afternoon, he and the others were served chilled fruit juice or chilled chocolate milk. Apart from the doctors and nurses, no one ever disturbed him. For a little while in the morning, he had to censor letters, but he was free after that to spend the rest of each day lying around idly with a clear conscience. He was comfortable in the hospital, and it was easy to stay on because he always ran a temperature of 101. He was even more comfortable than Dunbar, who had to keep falling down on his face in order to get his meals brought to him in bed. After he made up his mind to spend the rest of the war in the hospital, Yossarian wrote letters to everyone he knew, saying that he was in the hospital, never mentioning why. One day he had a better idea. To everyone he knew, he wrote that he was going on a very dangerous mission. They asked for volunteers. It's very dangerous, but someone has to do it. I'll write you the instant I get back. He had not written anyone since. All the officer patients in the ward were forced to censor letters written by all the enlisted men patients who were kept in residence in wards of their own. It was a monotonous job, and Yossarian was disappointed to learn that the lives of enlisted men were only slightly more interesting than the lives of officers. And the first day he had no curiosity at all. To break with the monotony, he invented games. Death to all modifiers, he declared one day, and out of every letter that passed through his hands went every adverb and every adjective. The next day, he made war on articles. He reached a much higher plane of creativity the following day when he blacked out everything in the letters but a, and the. That erected a more dynamic intralinear tension, he felt, and just about every case left the message more universal. Soon, he was untouched. He was prescribing parts of the salutation and signatures and leaving the text totally there. One time, he blacked out all but the salutation, Dear Mary, from a letter. At the bottom he wrote, I yearn for your tragically, A.T. Tapman, chaplain, U.S. Army. A.T. Tapman was the group's chaplain's name. When he had exhausted all possibilities in the letters, he began attacking the names and addresses on the envelope, obliterating whole homes and streets, annihilating entire metropolises with careless flicks of his wrist, as though he were God. Catch-22 required that each censored letter bear the censoring officer's name. Most letters didn't read at all. On those he didn't read at all, he wrote his own name. On those he did read, he wrote Washington Irving. And when that grew monotonous, he wrote Irving Washington. Censoring the envelopes had serious repercussions, producing a ripple of anxiety on some ethereal military echelon that floated a CID man back into the ward posing as a patient. They all knew he was a CID man because he kept inquiring about an officer named Irving or Washington, and because after his first day there, he wouldn't censor letters. He found them too monotonous. It was a good ward this time, one of the best he and Dunbar ever enjoyed. Well, this time was the 24-year-old fighter pilot captain with the spare golden mustache who had been shot into the Adriatic Sea in midwinter and had not even caught cold. Now the summer was upon them. The captain had not been shot down, and he said he had the grip. In the bed on Yossarian's right, still lying amorously on his belly, was the startled captain with malaria in his blood and a mosquito bite on his ass. Across the aisle from Yossarian was Dunbar, and sat next to Dunbar was the artillery captain with whom Yossarian had stopped playing chess. The captain was a good chess player, and the games were always interesting. Yossarian had stopped playing chess with him because the games were so interesting they were foolish. Then there was the educated Texan from Texas, who looked like someone in Technicolor and felt patriotically that people of means, decent folk, should be given more votes than drifters, whores, criminals, degenerate, atheists, and indecent folk, people without means. Yossarian was unspringing rhythms in the letters that day. They brought the Texan in. It was another quiet, hot, untroubled day. The heavy pressed heavily on the roof, stifling around. Dunbar was lying motionless on his back again, with the eyes staring up in the ceiling like a doll's. He was working hard at increasing his lifespan. He did it by cultivating boredom. Dunbar was working so hard at increasing his lifespan that Yossarian thought he was dead. They put the Texan in a bed in the middle of the ward, and it wasn't long before he donated his views. Dunbar sat up like a shot. "That's it," he cried excitedly. "There was something missing. All this time I knew there was something missing, and now I know what it is." He banged his fists down into his palm. "No patriotism," he declared. "You're right," Yossarian shouted back. "You're right, you're right, you're right. The hot dog, the Brooklyn Dodgers, Mom's apple pie, that's what everyone's fighting for, but who's fighting for decent folk? Who's fighting for more votes for the decent folk? There's no patriotism, that's what it is, and no matriotism either." The warrant officer on Yossarian's left was unimpressed. "Who gives a shit?" he asked tiredly, and he turned over on his side to go to sleep. The Texan turned out to be good-natured, generous, and likable. In 3 days, no one could stand him. He sent shudders of annoyance scampering up ticklish spines, and everybody fled from him, especially everybody but the soldier in white, who had no choice. The soldier in white was encased from head to toe in plaster and gauze. He had 2 useless legs and 2 useless arms. He had been smuggled into the ward during the night, and the men had no idea he was among them till they awoke in the morning and saw 2 strange legs hoisted from the hips. The 2 strange arms anchored up perpendicularly, all 4 limbs pinioned strangely in the air by lead weights suspended darkly above them that never moved. Spewing into the bandages over the insides of both elbows were zipper lips through which he was fed clear liquid from a clear jar. The silent zinc pipe rose from cement on his groin and was coupled to a slim rubber hose that carried waste from his kidneys and drifted efficiently into a clear stopper jar on the floor. When the jar on the floor was full, the jar feeding his elbow was empty, and the 2 were simply switched quickly so that stuff could drip back into him. All they ever really saw of the soldier in white was a frayed black hole over his mouth. The soldier in white had been filled next to the Texan, and then the Texan sat sideways on his own bed, talked him through the morning, afternoon, and evening in a pleasant, sympathetic drawl. The Texan never minded that he got no reply. Temperatures were taken twice a day in the ward. Each of the morning and late afternoon nurse Kramers entered with a jar full of thermometers and worked their way up one side of the ward and down the other, distributing a thermometer to each patient. She managed the soldier in white by inserting the thermometer into the hole over his mouth and leaving it balanced there on his lower rim. Then he returned to the man in the first bed. She took his thermometer and recorded his temperature, then moved on to the next bed and continued around the ward again. One afternoon, when she had completed her first circuit of the ward and came a second time to the soldier in white, she read the temperature and discovered he was dead. "Murderer," Dunbar said quietly. The Texan looked up at him with an uncertain grin. "Killer," Yossarian said. "What are you talking about?" the Texan asked nervously. "You murdered him," said Dunbar. "You killed him," said Yossarian. The Texan shrank back. "You fellas are crazy. I didn't even touch him." "You murdered him," said Dunbar. "I heard you killed him," said Yossarian. "You killed him because he was Dunbar said. "You fellas are crazy," the Texan cried. "They don't allow in here. They got a special place for period. The sergeant smuggled them in, Dunbar said. The communist sergeant, said Yossarian, and you knew it. The warrant officer on Yossarian's left was unimpressed by the entire incident of the soldier in white. The warrant officer was unimpressed by everything and never spoke at all unless it was to show irritation. The day before Yossarian met the chaplain, a stove exploded in the mess hall and set fire to one side of the kitchen. An intense heat flashed through the area. Even in Yossarian's ward, almost 300 feet away, he could hear the roar of the blaze and the sharp cracks of flaming timber. Smoke sped across the orange-tinted windows. In about 15 minutes, the crashed trucks from the airfield arrived to fight the fire. For a frantic half hour, it was touch and go. Then the firemen began to get the upper hand. Suddenly, there was a monotonous old drone of bombers returning from a mission, and the firemen had to roll up their hoses and speed back to the field in case one of the planes crashed and caught fire. The planes landed safely. As soon as the last one was down, the firemen wheeled their trucks around and raced back up the hill to resume their fight with the fire at the hospital. When they got there, the blaze was out. It had died out of its own accord and expired completely without even an ember to be watered down, and there was nothing for the disappointed firemen to do but drink tepid coffee and hang around trying to screw the nurses. The chaplains arrived the very day after the fire. Yossarian was busy expurgating all but romance words from letters when the chaplain sat down in a chair between the beds and asked him how he was feeling. He placed himself a bit to one side, and the captain's bars on the tape of his shirt collar were all the insignia Yossarian could see. Yossarian had no idea who he was and just took it for granted that he was either a doctor or another madman. Oh, pretty good, he answered. I got a slight pain in my liver. I haven't had the most regular of fellows, I guess. But all in all, I must admit, I feel pretty good. That's good, said the chaplain. Yes, Yossarian said. That is good. I meant to come around sooner, the chaplain said, but I really haven't been well. That's too bad, Yossarian said. Just a head cold, the chaplain added quickly. I've got a fever of 101, Yossarian added just quickly. That's too bad, said the chaplain. Yes, Yossarian agreed. That is too bad. The chaplain fidgeted. Is there anything I can do for you? He asked after a while. No, Yossarian sighed. The doctors are all doing what's humanly possible, I suppose. No, the chaplain colored faintly. I don't mean anything like that. I mean cigarettes or books or toys. No, Yossarian said. Thank you. I have everything I need, I suppose. Everything but good health. That's too bad. Yes, Yossarian said. That is too bad. The chaplain stirred again. He looked from side to side a few minutes, then gazed up at the ceiling, down at the floor. He drew a deep breath. Lieutenant Nately sends his regards, he said. Yossarian was sorry to hear they had a mutual friend. It seemed there was a basis to their conversation after all. You know Lieutenant Nately? He asked regretfully. Yeah, I know Lieutenant Nately quite well. A bit loony, isn't he? The chaplain's smile was embarrassed. I'm afraid I couldn't say. I don't think I knew him all that well. You can take my word for it, Yossarian said. He's goofy as they come. The chaplain weighted the next silence heavily and then shattered it with an abrupt question. You are Captain Yossarian, aren't you? Nately had a bad start. He came from a good family. Please excuse me, the chaplain persisted timorously. I may be committed a very grave error. You are Captain Yossarian? Yes, Captain Yossarian confessed. I am Captain Yossarian of the 256th Squadron. Of the 256th Squadron, Yossarian replied. I didn't know there were any other Captain Yossarians. As far as I know, I'm the only Captain Yossarian I know, and that's only as far as I know. I see, the chaplain said unhappily. There's two to fighting the 8th power. That's two to the fighting 8th power, Yossarian pointed out. If you're thinking of writing a symbolic poem about our squadron. No, mumbled the chaplain. I'm not thinking of writing a symbolic poem about your squadron. Yossarian straightened sharply when he spied the tiny silver cross on the other side of the chaplain's collar. He was thoroughly astonished, but he had never really talked with a chaplain before. You're a chaplain, he exclaimed ecstatically. I didn't know you were a chaplain. Why, yes, the chaplain answered. You didn't know I was a chaplain? Why, no, I didn't know you were a chaplain. Yossarian stared at him with a big, fascinating grin. I've never really seen a chaplain before. The chaplain flushed again and gazed down at his hands. He was a slight man of about 32, with tan hair and brown, indifferent eyes. His face was narrow rather than pale. An innocent nest of ancient pimple pricks lay in the basin of each cheek. Yossarian wanted to help him. Can I do anything at all to help you? The chaplain asked. Yossarian shook his head, still grinning. No, I'm sorry. I have everything I need, and I'm quite comfortable. In fact, I'm not even sick. That's good. As soon as the chaplain said the words, he was sorry and shoved his knuckles into his mouth with a giggle of alarm. But Yossarian remained silent and disappointed him. There are other men in the group I must visit, he apologized finally. I'll come to see you again probably tomorrow. Please do that, Yossarian said. I'll come only if you want me to, the chaplain said, lowering his head shyly. I've noticed that I make many of the men uncomfortable. Yossarian glowed with affection. I want you to, he said. You won't make me uncomfortable. The chaplain beamed gracefully and then peered down the side of a slip of paper that he had been concealing in his hand all the while. He counted along the beds of the ward, moving his lips, and then centered his attention dubiously on Dunbar. May I inquire, he whispered softly, if that is Lieutenant Dunbar? Yes, Yossarian finally answered loudly. That is Lieutenant Dunbar. Thank you, the chaplain whispered. Thank you very much. I must visit with him. I must visit with every member of the group who's in the hospital. Even those in other wards? Yossarian asked. Even those in other wards. Be careful in those other wards, Father, Yossarian warned. That's where they keep the mental cases. They're filled with lunatics. It isn't necessary to call me Father, the church chaplain explained. I'm an Anabaptist. I'm dead serious about those other wards, Yossarian continued grimly. MPs won't protect you, because they're the craziest of all. I'd go with you myself, but I'm scared stiff. Insanity is contagious. This is the only sane ward in the whole hospital. Everybody is crazy but us. This is probably the only sane ward in the whole world, for that matter. The chaplain rose quickly and edged away from Yossarian's bed, and then nodded with a conciliating smile, promising to conduct himself with appropriate caution. And now I must visit Lieutenant Dunbar, he said. Still he lingered, remorsefully. How is Lieutenant Dunbar? He asked at last. As good as they go, Yossarian assured him. A true prince, one of the finest, least dedicated men in the whole world. I didn't mean that, the chaplain answered. Is he very sick? No, he isn't very sick. In fact, he isn't sick at all. That's good, the chaplain sighed with relief. Yes, Yossarian said, that is good. A chaplain, Dunbar said when the chaplain had visited him. Did you see that? A chaplain. Wasn't he sweet? Maybe they should give him 3 votes. Who's they? Dunbar demanded suspiciously. And in the bed of a small private section at the end of the ward, always working ceaselessly behind the green plyboard partition, was a solemn middle-aged colonel who visited every day by a gentle, sweet-faced woman with curly ash-blonde hair, who was not a nurse and not a WAC and not a Red Cross girl, but who nevertheless appeared faithfully in the hospital at Pianosa each afternoon, wearing a pretty pastel summer dress that was very smart, with white leather pumps, with half-high heels and bases of nylon, and seams that were inevitably straight. The colonel was in communications, and he kept busily day to day, night to night, transmitting glutinous messages from interior to square pads of gauze, which he sealed meticulously and delivered to a covered white pail that stood on the night table beside his bed. The colonel was gorgeous. He had a cavernous mouth, cavernous cheeks, cavernous, sad, western eyes. His face was the color of clouded silver. He coughed quietly, gingerly, dabbed the pad slowly at his lips with a distaste that had become automatic. The colonel dwelt in a vortex of specialists who were all still specializing in trying to determine what was troubling him. They hurled lights in his eyes to see if he could see, rammed needles into his nerves to hear if he could feel. There was a urologist for his urine, a lymphologist for his lymph, an endocrinologist for his endocrines, a psychologist for his psyche, a dermatologist for his derma, there was a pathologist for his pathos, a cystologist for his cysts, and a bald and pedantic cytologist from the zoology department at Harvard, who had been shanghaied ruthlessly into the medical corps by a faulty anode in an IBM machine, and spent a session with the dying colonel trying to discuss Moby Dick with him. The colonel had really been investigated. There was not an organ of his body that had not been drugged and derogated, dusted and dredged, fingered and photographed, removed, plundered, and replaced. Neat, slender, and erect, the woman touched him as often as she sat by his bedside, and was the epitome of stately sorrow each time she smiled. The colonel was tall, thin, and stooped, and when he rose to walk, he bent forward even more, making a deep cavity of his body. He placed his feet down very carefully, moving ahead by inches from the knees down. There were violet pools under his eyes. The woman spoke softer than even the colonel coughed, and none of the men in the ward ever heard her voice. In less than 10 days, the Texan cleared the ward. The artillery captain broke first, and after that the exodus started. Dunbar, Yossarian, and the fighter captain all bolted the same morning. Dunbar stopped having dizzy spells, and the fighter captain blew his nose. Yossarian told the doctors that in the pain in his liver had gone away. It was easy as that. Even the warrant officer fled, and in less than 10 days, the Texan drove everybody in the ward back to duty. Everybody but the CID man who had caught the cold from the fighter captain and come down with pneumonia. Chapter 2, Cleavinger.